Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The breaking point. Have you ever woken up and felt like your life belonged to someone else? Like the alarm clock wasn't just interrupting your sleep, but your entire existence? I remember that morning so clearly. It was raining in Seattle, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones, and I lay there staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzing with emails I didn't want to read, my calendar already full of meetings I didn't care about. And my heart pounding with a question I'd been avoiding for years: what if I just stopped? What if I walked away from everything I'd built and chose nothing instead? That question terrified me more than failure, because choosing nothing felt like admitting I'd been living someone else's story all along. I was 29 years old, working as a project manager at a tech company, making more money than my parents ever dreamed of. Yet I couldn't remember the last time I felt genuinely excited about anything. My therapist called it burnout. My mother called it ungrateful. My friends called it the Seattle freeze, that emotional numbness that creeps in when you've been running on caffeine and ambition for too long. But I called it something else, the quiet desperation of a life that looked perfect on paper but felt like a cage made of gold. And the worst part? I couldn't even explain why. I had everything: a supportive family back in Texas, a boyfriend who loved me, a corner office with a view of the Space Needle, yet every morning I'd sit in my car before work, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that this was what grown-ups did, that happiness was overrated, that security was more important than freedom. But somewhere between my 30th birthday and another gray Seattle winter, something inside me cracked. It wasn't dramatic, no breakdown, no screaming match with my boss, just a quiet, terrifying realization that if I didn't change something, I'd wake up at 40 and wonder where my life went. So I made a decision that shocked everyone, including myself. I quit. Not just my job, but the entire life I'd built. I gave my notice, broke up with my boyfriend, sublet my apartment, and bought a one-way ticket to a place I'd never visited. A tiny town in New Mexico. Because I'd seen a photo of the desert sky online, one image of stars so bright they looked fake, and something in my chest whispered, there. When I called my mother to tell her I was quitting, the silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Con, what will people think?" It wasn't anger, it was fear. She'd sacrificed everything so I wouldn't have to struggle, and now I was choosing struggle voluntarily. I couldn't make her understand that sometimes the hardest prison to escape is the one you've decorated yourself. The week before I left, I walked through Seattle like a ghost, saying goodbye to places that had once defined me, and the strangest thing happened. As I let go of each place, I felt lighter. Not sadder, just unburdened. It was the same feeling I had as a child in Texas, lying in the grass and watching clouds drift by, not needing to know where they were going. Just enjoying the movement. I'd forgotten that feeling somewhere between college and the corporate world, that simple pleasure of existing without having to prove anything. The plane touched down in Albuquerque at sunset, and the sky was so vast it made my chest ache. I'd rented a tiny casita outside Santa Fe, a place with no Wi-Fi, no distractions, just a bed, a kitchen, and a porch that faced the mountains. My family thought I'd lost my mind. My friends thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. But standing there on that dusty road, with nothing but my luggage and an overwhelming sense of relief, I realized that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you've been lost all along. For years, I'd measured my worth by my productivity, my salary, my relationship status, external markers that had nothing to do with who I actually was. And now, in this strange, quiet place with no one watching, no one expecting anything from me, I had to answer the hardest question of all. Who am I when no one needs me to be anyone? That answer wouldn't come quickly. It would take months of loneliness, confusion, and unexpected discovery. But standing there under that enormous New Mexico sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in a decade: possibility. Not a plan, not an answer, just a door opening. And behind that door was a story I never expected to live, a love I never saw coming, and a version of myself I didn't even know existed. But that night, as I unpacked my single suitcase, I had no idea how much was about to change. I just knew I was finally awake. The real question wasn't why I left, but what I would find, and what I found would rewrite everything I thought I knew about love, language, and the meaning of home. The decision that scared everyone. You know what's harder than making a life-changing decision? Telling everyone else about it. I'd barely unpacked my suitcase in that tiny New Mexico casita when my phone started exploding with messages from everyone I'd left behind. My mother called 7 times in the first hour alone. Each ring felt like a tiny electric shock, reminding me that my freedom was causing someone else pain. Are you okay? Did you eat? Do you need money? She'd ask, her voice trembling with that particular Vietnamese mother worry that could make you feel both loved and suffocated at the same time. I'd spent my entire life trying to make her proud, to prove that her sacrifices meant something, and now I was throwing it all away for, what? A desert? A feeling? She couldn't understand that sometimes you have to break something beautiful to build something more authentic. But the hardest conversation wasn't with my mother, it was with my best friend Sarah, who'd known me since college. Who'd held my hand through every breakup and celebrated every promotion. You're running away, she said flatly, not even trying to hide her disappointment. You're not finding yourself, you're hiding from yourself. And for a moment, she was right. I felt like a coward disguised as an adventurer, someone who'd rather start over than fix what was broken. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable, until she sighed and said something that would haunt me for weeks. Just promise me you're not giving up on happiness. You're giving up on the life you thought would make you happy. There's a difference. I didn't understand what she meant then, but I'd replay those words over and over in my lonely desert nights, trying to decode their meaning. The thing about a gap year in America is that people either romanticize it or demonize it. There's no middle ground. My coworkers thought I was having a quarter-life crisis. My ex-boyfriend told everyone I was finding myself with a sarcastic eye roll that made me want to punch him through the phone. Even my younger brother, who'd always been my biggest cheerleader, sent me a text that read, "Are you sure you're not just bored?" And that question stung more than any other because maybe he was right. Maybe I was just bored of the routine, bored of the pressure. Bored of pretending that a corner office and a fat salary could fill the emptiness I'd been carrying since childhood. But here's what I've learned since then. Boredom isn't always a sign that something's wrong with you. Sometimes boredom is your soul screaming for attention, asking you to remember what it felt like to be curious, to be alive, to wake up excited about the day ahead. And the truth I couldn't admit to anyone was that I'd been bored for years. I'd just been too busy to notice. The gap year wasn't about running away. It was about finally listening to that boredom instead of drowning it out with work, with alcohol, with the constant noise of being successful. I spent my first week in New Mexico doing absolutely nothing. No alarms, no schedules, no expectations, and it was terrifying. I'd forgotten how to exist without producing something, how to sit in silence without reaching for my phone, how to be alone without feeling lonely. But slowly, something shifted. I started noticing things I'd never noticed before, the way the desert light changed from gold to pink to purple. The sound of wind through the sagebrush, the feeling of sun on my skin without the urgency to go inside and be productive. I was learning the language of stillness, and it was harder than any corporate presentation I'd ever given. But the loneliness was real, and it was brutal. I'd go to the local grocery store and struggle to understand the cashier's thick southern accent. She'd ask me how y'all doin'? And I'd freeze, my brain scrambling to translate words that should have been simple. English had always been my second language, but in Seattle, I'd surrounded myself with other immigrants, other transplants, other people who spoke with accents and understood the struggle. In New Mexico, I was the outsider, the city girl who didn't know how to pump her own gas or navigate the roads without GPS. I'd practice saying things out loud in my empty house. I'll have a coffee, please. How much is that? Thank you so much. Like a child learning to speak for the first time. It was humiliating and beautiful at the same time. I started carrying a small notebook everywhere, writing down phrases I'd heard and practicing them over dinner. My voice bouncing off the adobe walls like a prayer. And then, on my third week there, something unexpected happened that would change everything. I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when a figure appeared in the distance, a man walking toward my house with a dog. Looking as out of place as I felt. He stopped when he saw me, tipped his hat in that old-fashioned American way, and said something I couldn't quite catch. My heart raced. This was it, my first real conversation with a stranger in my new life. I opened my mouth to speak, and everything I'd practiced vanished from my brain. All that came out was a mumbled sorry, I don't understand. He smiled, not with pity, but with patience, and repeated himself slowly. I said, beautiful sunset, isn't it? And in that moment, I realized that learning English wasn't about getting the grammar right. It was about connection. It was about being brave enough to sound foolish. And it was about to lead me into a story I'd never see coming. Arriving in a new world. You know that feeling when you step off a plane and the air hits you differently, like you're breathing a completely different planet? That's how New Mexico felt to me. The desert wasn't just a place. It was an entire sensory experience that my Seattle-trained body had no idea how to process. The heat was dry, almost aggressive, pressing against my skin like an unfamiliar handshake. The light was so bright it hurt my eyes, bouncing off the red rocks and sandy soil until everything shimmered like a mirage. And the silence, God, the silence was deafening. In Seattle, there was always noise, traffic, construction, the constant hum of people rushing somewhere important. Here, the quiet was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing. The tiny sounds of my own existence that I'd been drowning out for years. I'd rented a tiny casita outside Santa Fe, 100-year-old adobe house with thick walls that kept the heat out and the mystery in. The owner, an elderly woman named Margaret, had left me a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, "Welcome home. The faucet drips, the coyotes howl at night, and the stars here will change your life. Don't be afraid of the quiet." I read that note 3 times, tears streaming down my face, because I'd been afraid of the quiet my entire life. I'd filled every silence with podcasts, music, work, conversations, anything to avoid being alone with my own thoughts. Now I had no choice. The first week was brutal. I'd wake up at 6 a.m. out of habit, reach for my phone, and remember there was no Wi-Fi, no urgent emails, no meetings to prepare for. The emptiness felt like physical pain. I'd walk to the local grocery store, a tiny place called La Tienda that smelled like roasted chiles and old wood, and I'd freeze at the checkout counter, my brain short-circuiting when the cashier asked me a simple question. "Cash or card?" She'd say, and I'd stare at her like she'd asked me to solve a physics problem. English, which I'd spoken fluently for years, suddenly felt foreign. Accents I'd never heard before, phrases I'd never encountered, "How's your day going, honey?" threw me off balance completely. I'd practiced English in classrooms, in corporate meetings, in professional settings where everyone spoke carefully and precisely. Real American English, the kind spoken in small towns, was a completely different language. People slurred words together, dropped consonants, used idioms I'd never heard. "Y'all fixin' to, might could," these phrases confused and fascinated me. I started carrying a small notebook everywhere, jotting down new expressions like a detective collecting clues. "Well, I wrote one day after the cashier said it to me, having no idea what it meant. I spent that evening Googling American idioms in my phone, the only connection I had to my old world. Laughing at how little I actually knew about the country I'd lived in for 8 years. I wasn't just a foreigner anymore, I was a foreigner in my own adopted home. The loneliness crept in around day 4, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. I'd sit on my porch watching the sunset, the sky exploding into colors I couldn't name. And I'd feel so achingly alone that I'd double over with the weight of it. No one knew where I was. No one understood why I'd come. I'd left behind everything familiar, the sounds, the smells, the people who knew me, and replaced it with this vast, beautiful, terrifying emptiness. I started talking to myself in English just to hear a voice. "You're okay," I'd say out loud. "You made the right choice. Just give it time." But the words felt hollow, meaningless, like I was reciting a script I didn't believe. Then, on a Tuesday morning, something shifted. I'd walked into town to buy groceries and stopped at a small cafe called the Oasis. The owner, a gruff-looking man in his 60s with a beard that looked like it had stories to tell, asked me what I wanted. My voice came out shaky. Coffee, please. Black. He nodded and poured me a cup, then said something that caught me off guard. You ain't from around here, are ya? His accent was so thick I had to replay his words in my head twice. I laughed nervously and shook my head. I'm from Seattle, I said, feeling like I was confessing a crime. He chuckled, a warm, genuine sound, and said, well, welcome to the real America, sweetheart. You're gonna learn a lot here. I didn't know it then, but that man and that coffee shop would become my lifeline. The place where I'd start to piece together not just the language but also the person I was becoming. And that night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars appear one by one, I realized something that made my chest ache with hope. Maybe being lost was the first step to actually being found. The journey was just beginning, and I had no idea how beautiful it would be. The loneliness of being different. You know what nobody tells you about running away to find yourself? That you might not like who you find at first. The second week in New Mexico hit me like a freight train, not the dramatic kind of breakdown you see in movies, but something quieter and more insidious. The slow realization that I had absolutely no idea who I was without my job, my routines, my identity as a successful woman. I'd spent years building a version of myself that looked good on LinkedIn, but in the desert, stripped of all those labels. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. The mornings were the hardest. I'd wake up with that familiar panic, the feeling that I was forgetting something important, and then remember there was nothing to forget. Nowhere to be, no one expecting anything from me. And instead of feeling free, I felt terrified. I'd wander into town just to be around people, even if I couldn't understand them. I'd sit in the Oasis coffee shop for hours, nursing a single cup of coffee, watching locals talk and laugh in that easy way people have when they belong somewhere. Their English was fast and fluid, full of expressions I'd never heard. I reckon, over yonder, fixin' to do something. I'd write them down in my notebook and practice them at home, but when I tried to use them, they felt wrong in my mouth. Like borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit. The cashier at La Tienda, a woman named Rosa who'd lived in Santa Fe her whole life, would smile at me with pity in her eyes and speak extra slowly, as if I were a child. You new here? She asked one day, and I nodded, feeling a familiar heat creep up my neck, the shame of being different, of not belonging, of being the outsider who everyone notices but no one quite knows what to do with. I'd felt that way as a child in Texas, the only Vietnamese kid in my elementary school, and somehow, decades later, here I was again. The loneliness wasn't just about being alone, it was about being misunderstood. I'd call my mother and try to explain what I was doing, why I'd left everything behind. And she'd respond with that particular Vietnamese silence that meant she was worried but didn't want to say it. Con, she'd finally say, her voice soft, you are old enough to know what you want. But I pray you don't regret this. I couldn't tell her that regret was already a constant companion, whispering doubts in my ear at 3 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. What if I'd made a terrible mistake? What if this wasn't finding myself but losing myself completely? What if the person I was becoming was just as lost as the person I'd been? I started questioning everything, my English, my accent, even the way I walked and held myself. In Seattle, I'd been confident, competent, someone who commanded respect in boardrooms. Here, I was just another foreigner with a funny accent and a confused expression. I'd catch my reflection in the window of the Oasis and barely recognize myself, the same face, but with something missing behind the eyes. And then, on a particularly lonely Friday evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I walked into town and sat down at a table next to a group of older women who were knitting and chatting in that effortless southern drawl I still couldn't quite follow. They glanced at me, smiled politely, and returned to their conversation. But instead of retreating into my shell, I took a deep breath and said something that surprised even me. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm trying to learn English better. Would you mind if I listened?" They looked at each other, then back at me, and the one closest to me, a silver-haired woman named Betty, patted the empty chair beside her. "Sit down, honey," she said, her voice warm as honey. "We'll teach you everything you need to know." That was the moment everything started to shift. Betty and her friends, Martha, Dorothy, and Jean, adopted me like a stray cat. They'd lived in Santa Fe their whole lives, had watched the town change and grow, had buried husbands and raised children and knew everything about everyone. They spoke slowly for me, repeated things I didn't understand, and laughed good-naturedly at my mistakes. "You say we were around here," Betty corrected me one afternoon, and I looked at her, confused. Because I'd learned the grammar rules perfectly in school. "I know it's wrong," she said, winking. "But that's how we talk. You don't want to sound like a textbook, honey. You want to sound like a person." It was the most freeing thing anyone had ever said to me. I'd been so obsessed with speaking perfect English that I'd forgotten the point of language, connection. And in that tiny coffee shop, surrounded by elderly women who'd never left their hometown, I started learning a new kind of English, not the version you find in textbooks or corporate handbooks, but the living, breathing language of real people. I'd walk home from those afternoons feeling lighter, my notebook full of phrases I'd never use in a boardroom but would use in real life. And I'd look up at that vast New Mexico sky and think, maybe language isn't about being correct. Maybe it's about being understood. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally starting to be understood by someone. A stranger in the desert. What if the person who changes your life doesn't look like anything special at first? Just a man, a dog, and a dusty pickup truck that's older than you are? That's how Sam entered my world, not with fireworks or dramatic music, but with the most ordinary question in the world: "You need a ride into town?" I'd been walking down that dirt road for 20 minutes, sweating under the brutal New Mexico sun, when this stranger pulled up beside me in a blue Ford that rattled like it was held together by hope. Every instinct screamed, "Don't get in." But something in his eyes, warm, patient, utterly non-threatening, made me pause. He wasn't movie star handsome, but there was something grounded about him. Like he'd been planted in this desert and grown roots deep enough to survive anything. "I'm Sam," he said, extending a hand rough with calluses. "I live about a mile down the road. Saw you walking past my place and figured you could use a break." Immediately put her head on my lap and looked up at me with that pure, unfiltered love that only dogs can give. In that moment, I felt like I'd made the right decision, even if every logical part of my brain disagreed. We drove in silence for a few minutes, just the hum of the engine and Daisy's contented breathing, before Sam asked the question I'd been dreading. "So what brings you here?" I could have given him the short answer, I needed a change, but something about his voice made me want to tell him the truth. "I quit my job in Seattle," I said slowly, feeling the words leave my mouth like confessions. "Broke up with my boyfriend. Sold my apartment. Came here because I saw a picture of the desert and it made me feel something I couldn't explain." Sam nodded, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "That's brave," he said simply. "Most people don't follow a feeling like that. They stay where they are, hoping it goes away, and wake up 60 years old wondering what happened." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt tears prick my eyes, not sad tears, but the kind that come when someone sees you clearly and doesn't run away. "My ex-boyfriend thinks I'm having a breakdown," I admitted, my voice shaky. "My mom thinks I'm lost. Sometimes I think they're right." Sam chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that made me feel less alone. "Lost is just a word for not knowing where you're going yet," he said. "I've been lost my whole life. Doesn't mean I haven't found a few things along the way." We pulled into the Oasis parking lot, and I realized I'd been so focused on our conversation that I'd barely noticed the ride. I reached for the door handle, but Sam stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm. "Listen," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I can tell when someone's running toward something instead of away from it. You're running toward something. You just don't know what it is yet." He smiled, and for a moment, I felt like the universe had put him in my path for a reason. That's how it started, not as a dramatic romance, but as a slow, surprising friendship. Sam started picking me up every few days, showing me the hidden spots of New Mexico that tourists never find. Ancient petroglyphs carved into red rocks, hot springs tucked away in canyons. Tiny diners with green chili cheeseburgers so good they made me want to cry. He spoke slowly for me, repeating words I didn't catch, laughing at my mistakes in a way that felt affectionate, not cruel. "You say I see not I saw around here," he'd correct gently, and I'd roll my eyes and repeat it back, hearing my own accent soften and shift. I started learning English from him not as a student learns from a teacher, but as a child learns from a parent, absorbing it through context and emotion and the simple pleasure of being understood. I told him about Seattle, his silence more comforting than any advice. And somewhere between the desert sunsets and late-night conversations, I started feeling something I wasn't ready to name. But one evening, sitting on his porch under a blanket of stars so bright they felt close enough to touch, Sam turned to me and said the words that stopped my heart, "I think I'm falling in love with you." I know it's crazy, but I couldn't keep it to myself. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, no words in English, no words in any language. Just the overwhelming feeling that I'd finally found what I'd been running toward. And then he said something that changed everything. "But there's something you should know about me first." Learning to speak again. You know that moment when you realize you've been speaking a language your whole life, but never really understood it? That's how I felt when Sam's words hung in the air between us. There's something you should know about me first. And suddenly English wasn't just a language anymore. It was a bridge, a barrier, a mystery I desperately needed to solve. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, and my brain was scrambling to translate not just his words, but the weight behind them. The unspoken story that lingered in his eyes like a half-finished sentence. I was married, he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves were fragile and could shatter if spoken too loudly. Her name was Maria. She died 5 years ago. Cancer. The simplicity of his confession hit me harder than any elaborate explanation could have. In that moment, I realized that English, the language I'd studied for years, the language I'd used in boardrooms and presentations, had never prepared me for this. No textbook teaches you how to respond when someone shares their deepest pain with you. No grammar lesson explains the right verb tense for comforting a grieving heart. I opened my mouth, and the words that came out were clumsy and imperfect. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. But Sam just shook his head and smiled that gentle, sad smile that I was starting to recognize. That's okay, he said. You don't have to say anything. You just being here is enough. And in that moment, I learned something that would change my entire approach to English forever. Communication isn't about perfect grammar or flawless pronunciation, it's about connection, about showing up. About being present even when you don't have the right words. From that night on, our conversations shifted. We'd sit on his porch for hours, and he'd tell me about Maria, how they'd met in high school, how she'd loved the desert even more than he did. How she'd painted the sunsets on canvas until her hands gave out. I'd listen, my English improving not through practice but through genuine emotion, through the desperate desire to understand and be understood. I'd ask questions. What was her favorite color? How did you know you loved her? And each question taught me new vocabulary, new sentence structures, new ways to express curiosity and care. Sam would pause sometimes, searching for the right words. And I realized that even native speakers struggle sometimes, that language isn't about perfection but about reaching across the gap between two people. And saying, I see you. I hear you. I'm here. I started keeping a new journal, not for vocabulary lists or grammar rules, but for the things Sam said that touched my heart. Grief is love with no place to go, he told me one night, and I wrote it down immediately, not because I needed to remember it for a test, but because I needed to remember it for life. My English was getting better, not because I was studying, but because I was living. I was learning the language of loss, of love, of connection, and it was so much richer than any textbook I'd ever studied. The words came more easily now, flowing from my mouth without the hesitation that used to define my speech. I think I understand, I told him one evening, looking out at the vast desert sky. I think I understand why you stay here. Why this place feels like home. He turned to me, his eyes glistening, and said something that made my breath catch. I think I'm starting to understand that too. Maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's a person. Those words haunted me for days. Maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's a person. I'd repeat them to myself as I walked through town, as I practiced my English with Betty and her friends at the Oasis. As I tried to make sense of the feelings growing inside me. My conversations with the local women had become more fluent, more comfortable. I'd tell them about my week, about Sam, about the strange and beautiful uncertainty of my new life. "You're different now," Betty observed one afternoon, studying me over her knitting needles. "When you first came here, you talked like you were afraid someone would catch you making a mistake. Now you talk like you actually want to be heard." She was right. The fear was fading, replaced by something like confidence, not the false confidence of pretending to be perfect, but the real confidence of knowing that mistakes are part of the process, that every wrong word is a step toward the right one. I started speaking English without translating in my head first, letting the words come naturally, trusting that even if they weren't perfect, they were real. And something magical happened. The more I stopped worrying about being correct, the more correct I became. I'd catch myself using phrases I'd never studied, expressions I'd absorbed from the people around me. My accent was shifting too, not gone completely, but softer, more American, more like the voice of someone who actually belonged. But the biggest change wasn't in my English, it was in my heart. I was falling in love with Sam, and with the life I was building here, and with the person I was becoming. And that night, as I walked home under the stars, I realized that language wasn't about fluency, it was about feeling. And for the first time in years, I felt everything. Love in slow motion. Have you ever felt like your heart was learning a new language faster than your mouth could keep up? That's how it was with Sam. Every day, I felt myself falling deeper, but the words to express it seemed to get stuck somewhere between my brain and my tongue. English, which had finally started to feel natural, suddenly felt inadequate again, not because I couldn't speak it, but because love demanded a vocabulary I'd never learned. I'd lie awake at night, practicing phrases in my head. "I love you. I think I'm falling in love with you. You make me feel like I'm home." But when I was actually with Sam, sitting on his porch watching the sunset, all those carefully rehearsed sentences would evaporate into the desert air, leaving me silent and frustrated. "You're quiet tonight," Sam observed one evening, his voice gentle. "Everything okay?" I nodded, but my heart was screaming. No, everything wasn't okay. I was in love with a man I'd known for only a few months, a man who was still grieving his dead wife. A man who spoke English with an accent I could finally understand, but whose heart was still a mystery to me. And I couldn't find the words to tell him any of it. I'd come to New Mexico to find myself, but instead, I'd found someone who made me realize I'd been looking in all the wrong places. "I'm learning to speak again," I said finally, which wasn't a lie but also wasn't the truth. Not just English. I'm learning to say what I actually feel. Sam looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, and then he did something that made my breath catch. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine like they'd always belonged there. The touch was electric, sending shivers up my arm and straight to my heart. We'd never held hands before, we'd been careful, respectful, aware of the invisible boundaries that grief had built between us. But in that moment, those boundaries dissolved, and I realized that love doesn't follow any rules you can learn in a classroom. It doesn't care about verb tenses or prepositions or any of the grammar rules I'd spent years memorizing. It just is. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Not of you. Of feeling this much. Of losing it. Of saying the wrong thing and ruining everything. Sam squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. You can't say the wrong thing to me, he said. I've been through the worst loss a person can experience. There's nothing you could say that would scare me away. And in that moment, I realized that the English I'd been learning, the careful, correct, textbook English, had been preparing me for a world that didn't exist. Real life, real love, real connection doesn't happen in perfect sentences. It happens in the pauses, the stumbles, the imperfect words that somehow say everything. I love you, I said, my voice trembling but clear. I know it's fast. I know we haven't known each other long. But I love you, Sam. And I don't know how to say it in a way that sounds right, because nothing about this feels textbook correct. He pulled me into his arms, and I felt his heart beating against mine, steady and strong. You said it perfectly, he whispered into my hair. I love you too. After that night, everything shifted. We started building a life together, not the kind of life I'd planned in Seattle, with corner offices and 401k plans. But something simpler and more authentic. I moved into his house, a modest adobe home with creaky floors and windows that faced the mountains. And I started learning a new kind of English, the language of domesticity, of partnership. Of two people figuring out how to love each other despite their scars. I'd cook Vietnamese food in his kitchen, and he'd tease me about my accent when I said pho wrong. It's pho, not pho, he'd correct me, and I'd throw a kitchen towel at him, laughing. What do you know about Vietnamese food? I'd ask. I know I love you, he'd reply, and suddenly my English wasn't just functional, it was fluent, because it was fueled by joy. I told my mother about Sam in a phone call that lasted 2 hours, switching between English and Vietnamese as my emotions demanded. She was skeptical at first, Con, you just met him, but she heard the happiness in my voice, the lightness I'd been missing for years. If he makes you happy, she finally said, then I'm happy. And in that moment, I realized that the gap year I'd taken wasn't just about finding myself, it was about finding the language to tell my story. To connect with others, to build a life that felt true. My English had improved, yes, but more importantly, my heart had learned to speak. Sam proposed 6 months later, under that same desert sky where we'd first said I love you. His proposal wasn't perfect, he stumbled over his words, mixed up his tenses, ended up asking me in the most American way possible. Will you marry me? I mean, would you want to? I mean, I love you, and I kissed him before he could finish, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, I said. In English, in Vietnamese, in any language you want. The answer is yes. Building a home together. What happens when two people from completely different worlds decide to build a life together? The answer isn't romantic, it's chaotic, beautiful, and full of misunderstandings that somehow make everything better. Sam and I got married in a tiny chapel in Santa Fe, with Betty and her knitting friends as witnesses. And my mother watching through a video call from Texas, crying so hard I could barely understand her Vietnamese accented English. "Con, you look so happy," she kept repeating, and she was right. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely, unshakably happy. But happiness doesn't mean easy, and our first year of marriage taught me more about English, about love, and about myself than any year of formal education ever could. We argued about everything: how to load the dishwasher. He insisted on a specific pattern that made no sense to me. How to fold towels. Apparently there's a correct way I'd never learned, even how to pronounce certain words. "It's caramel, not caramel," Sam would correct me, and I'd roll my eyes and say whatever, "it's just a candy," which would make him laugh and kiss my forehead. Those small arguments became lessons in communication, in patience, in the art of being wrong gracefully. My English was improving, but not because I was studying, because I was living. Every disagreement taught me new vocabulary: compromise, negotiation, surrender, which I learned meant "you're right, and I'm tired of fighting." And every resolution taught me the most important word of all: together. The real challenge came when we decided to have children. I'd always wanted a family, but I'd never imagined building one with someone whose culture, background, and worldview were so different from mine. Sam was as American as apple pie, raised in New Mexico, never traveled abroad, spoke only English with a thick southwestern drawl. I was Vietnamese American, raised between two worlds, fluent in both languages but never fully belonging to either. How would we raise our children? What language would we speak at home? What traditions would we pass down? These questions haunted me throughout my pregnancy, filling my nights with anxiety and my days with endless conversations with Sam, conversations that tested my English skills in ways I'd never anticipated. "I want them to know Vietnamese," I told him one night, my voice trembling with emotion. "I want them to know where I came from, even if I'm not always sure myself." Sam listened quietly, then took my hands in his. "Then we'll teach them," he said simply. "We'll teach them everything: Vietnamese, English, how to make pho, how to love the desert, how to be proud of who they are." And in that moment, I realized that the language of family wasn't about choosing one culture over another, it was about creating something new. Something that belonged only to us. I started speaking Vietnamese to my pregnant belly, whispering stories from my childhood, hoping the baby could hear the love in my voice even if they couldn't understand the words. When our son was born, we named him Minh Sam, my Vietnamese name for his first, his American name for his second. It was our first compromise, our first lesson in building a bridge between two worlds. I spoke to him in Vietnamese, Sam spoke to him in English, and together, we created a linguistic tapestry that was uniquely ours. I'd watch Sam struggle with Vietnamese words, his accent thick and clumsy, and I'd correct him with the same patience he'd shown me when I'd first arrived in New Mexico. "It's Xian Chow, not Sin Chow," I'd say, and he'd repeat it back until it was close enough. We were both learning, both growing, both becoming something new. And in that process, I discovered something beautiful: language isn't a competition. It's not about being perfect or correct or sounding like a native speaker. It's about connection, about love, about reaching across the gap between two people and saying I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. My English had become fluent, but more importantly, I'd become fluent in the language of partnership, of compromise, of unconditional love. Min-sam was born on a warm June morning, and when I held him in my arms for the first time, I whispered to him in both languages, I love you. Miyu Khan. The words felt right, felt true, felt like the beginning of a story I'd never expected to live. But as I looked at Sam's tear-streaked face, as I heard my mother's joyful sobs through the phone, I realized that this was exactly where I was supposed to be, not in Seattle, not in a corner office, but in a tiny house in the desert. Building a home that was built on love. And then, something happened that would change everything, again. The unexpected gift. Do you ever look at your children and see yourself in them, not just the way they look, but the way they speak? The way they move through the world like they've always known where they belong? That's what Min-sam gave me, a mirror that reflected not just my past, but the future I was building. He was 2 years old when he said his first full sentence in English. And I cried because it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, not because the sentence was perfect, but because it was proof that he was growing up in a world where he belonged. Mommy, look at the sky, he said, pointing at the New Mexico sunset, and I heard my own accent in his voice, that slight softness on the vowels. That careful pronunciation that marked him as the child of an immigrant. He was bilingual before he could tie his shoes, switching between Vietnamese and English with a fluidity that made my heart ache. I'd speak to him in Vietnamese, Sam would speak in English, and somehow, in his tiny 2-year-old brain, he'd sorted it all out without ever being confused. Me, I want water, he'd say, mixing languages without hesitation, and I'd correct him gently, not because it mattered, but because I wanted him to know that both languages were his equally, fully, without apology. Watching him navigate 2 worlds so effortlessly made me realize something profound. I'd spent my whole life worrying about being enough American, enough Vietnamese, enough of anything, and my son had already figured out that you don't have to choose. You can be everything, all at once, and the world will still make room for you. Becoming a mother changed my English in ways I never expected. I started using simpler words, clearer sentences, because I wanted Min-sam to understand not just what I was saying, but how I was saying it, the love, the patience, the joy behind every syllable. I'd read him bedtime stories in both languages, watching his eyes grow heavy as he absorbed the rhythms of 2 entirely different worlds. Good night, moon, ndugon ne, I'd whisper, and he'd smile in his sleep, dreaming in a language that belonged to no one and everyone. Sam and I fell into a rhythm, him taking the morning shift, me handling the nights, and in those quiet moments, we'd talk in low voices about our dreams for our son. I want him to know he's loved, Sam said one night. I want him to know that love doesn't care about languages or borders or where you came from. It just is. I nodded, tears in my eyes, because that was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to me. My English had become fluent, but more than that, I'd become fluent in the language of hope, of possibility, of unconditional love. Min-sam was 3 when we had our second child, a daughter we named Lily. because she was small and delicate and reminded me of the flowers that bloomed in the desert after the rain. My mother cried when she heard the name, because Lily was the English translation of her own name, and in that moment, I knew I'd finally bridged the gap between my two worlds. The house was chaos now, toys everywhere, two children laughing and crying and growing in ways that made my head spin, but I'd never been happier. I'd gone from a corner office in Seattle to a tiny adobe house in New Mexico, from high-stakes meetings to messy breakfasts and endless laundry. And I'd never felt more successful. My English had become second nature, not because I'd studied more, but because I'd lived more. I could navigate any conversation now, from parent-teacher conferences to hospital visits, from arguments with Sam to heartfelt talks with my mother. The fear of making mistakes had disappeared, replaced by the confidence that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Sam started preschool, and on his first day, he said goodbye to me in both languages. Bye-bye, me. See you later. The other mothers looked at us with curiosity, but I didn't care. I was proud of who he was, who we were, this beautiful hybrid family that didn't fit into any neat category. And then, one ordinary afternoon, my mother called with news that would change everything again. Con, she said, her voice trembling, I'm coming to visit. I want to meet my grandchildren. I want to see your life. I dropped the phone, tears streaming down my face, because my mother had never visited me in the U.S., she'd always been too afraid. Too uncomfortable in a country she didn't understand. But now, she was coming. And I realized that the gap year I'd taken wasn't just about finding myself, it was about building a world so beautiful that even my mother, who'd sacrificed everything, wanted to be part of it. Why I still take breaks. What if the most important lesson of your life comes not from success, but from the moments you stopped trying so hard? My mother's visit changed everything, not because she arrived with answers, but because she arrived with questions I'd been avoiding for years. When she stepped off the plane in Albuquerque, I barely recognized her. She was smaller than I remembered, frilier, her hair completely gray now, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to hug me. Con, she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion, you look so happy. And in that moment, I realized that all the years of worrying about her approval, all the pressure to be perfect, had been entirely in my head. She'd never wanted me to be a corporate executive, she'd wanted me to be happy. The irony hit me like a wave. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn her approval, and all she'd ever wanted was to see me smile. She spent 2 weeks in New Mexico, meeting Sam and the children, learning to navigate the desert heat and the strong American coffee. She'd never spoken much English, she'd always been too shy, too embarrassed by her accent, but she tried, haltingly. Because she wanted to connect with her grandchildren. Hello, Sam, she'd say, her Vietnamese accent thick on the English words. I am Ba. I am your grandmother. And Sam would giggle and hug her, not caring about the accent or the grammar, just loving her for who she was. Watching my mother struggle with English was like looking in a mirror, the same hesitation, the same fear of being judged, the same desperate desire to be understood. But she was braver than I'd ever been, because she didn't let her fear stop her. She'd practice with me every night, repeating phrases over and over. I want coffee, please. Thank you. How much is this? Her accent was thick, her grammar imperfect, but her determination was absolute. You learn English, you can learn anything, she told me one evening. And I realized she was passing on a gift she'd never been able to give me before, the gift of seeing her struggle and succeed. I started teaching her, not as a teacher teaches a student, but as a daughter teaches a mother, with patience and love and endless encouragement. It's I would like, not I want. I'd correct her gently, and she'd repeat it back, her face lighting up when she got it right. In those moments, the tables had turned. I was the fluent one, the confident one, the one who could navigate the world with ease. And in teaching her, I realized that I'd finally become the person I was always meant to be, someone who helps others find their voice. Just as others had once helped me. The night before she left, we sat on the porch together, watching the desert sky darken into its blanket of stars. She'd never seen anything like it, the sky so vast and bright that it seemed to swallow the world whole. I understand now, she said softly, her English slow but clear. Why you came here. Why you stayed. This place is good for you. I took her hand, tears streaming down my face, because I knew this was her blessing, not just for my life in New Mexico, but for the person I'd become. Me, I said, using the Vietnamese word for mother, thank you for letting me find my own way. For trusting me. For loving me even when I was lost. She squeezed my hand and smiled. You were never lost, Con. You were just finding your path. And in that moment, I realized that the gap year I'd taken wasn't just about taking a break from work, it was about taking a break from the expectations I'd carried my whole life, from the fear of not being enough, from the need to prove myself to everyone. I'd come to New Mexico searching for something, and what I'd found was so much more than I'd ever imagined, a partner, a family, a home. And a fluency in both language and life that no classroom could ever teach. These days, I still take breaks. Not gap years, I have children to raise and a life to live, but small breaks, intentional pauses. Moments where I stop being productive and just exist. I sit on my porch and watch the sunset, just like I did my first week here. I listen to my children speak in their beautiful hybrid language, mixing Vietnamese and English without hesitation. I cook pho for my family and watch Sam struggle with chopsticks, laughing at how far we've both come. And I think about that question I asked myself so many years ago, what if I just stopped? Now I know the answer. When you stop, you make room for something new. When you pause, you give yourself permission to grow. And when you take a break from trying so hard, you might just find exactly what you were looking for. My English is fluent now, not perfect, not textbook correct, but real. It's the language of my life, of my love, of the beautiful mess I've built. And it all started with one brave decision to hit pause. So if you're watching this video, feeling stuck, feeling lost, feeling like you're running a race you never signed up for, take a breath. You're exactly where you need to be. The gap year was never about escaping. It was about finally arriving. That's all for today. I'll make more similar videos in the future. Please subscribe to watch.